Greetings, friends. We continue with our adventurous journey as we study the book of Job. And we want to talk today about the theological weight of the book of Job. For me, this is one of the most interesting, intriguing topics. Why? Because there is much theologically to talk about in the book of Job as compared to the historical aspect of the book. But it is important, friends, to note that the book of Job is not merely a story about suffering. It is one of Scripture's most profound theological explorations. The book of Job talks about the sovereignty of God, the justice of God, the nature of righteousness, the mystery of suffering, and the limits or limitations of human wisdom. Now, the book of Job leads us into deep doctrinal issues. Let's talk about some of the doctrines that are outlined in the book of Job. Firstly, the doctrine of God, which I would call proper theology in this case. At the heart of the book of Job is a towering vision of God. In other words, when we closely read or study the book of Job, these are some of the attributes of God that we find clearly stipulated and explained, outlined in the book of Job. Number one, God's absolute sovereignty. In Job chapters 1 and 2, God permits Satan to test Job. This reveals few things. It reveals that Satan is not autonomous. The devil is not autonomous. It also reveals that evil, Satan, or the devil operates under divine boundaries. God remains enthroned. The divine speeches in Job chapters 38 to 41 emphasize a few things. God is the creator, God is the sustainer, and God is the governor in times of chaos or troubles. This presentation of God aligns very well with the majestic creator imagery later seen in Genesis and celebrated poetically in Psalms. But what are some of the theological emphases of the book of Job? Primarily, the book of Job teaches us that God is not accountable to human reasoning. God is not accountable to human reasoning. So it teaches us about divine freedom. Why? Because God never explains the heavenly counsel to Job. Instead, he reveals his majesty. This teaches us that God is free. God is wise and beyond human comprehension. God's purposes are not reducible to human logic. Let's talk about the doctrine of suffering. Technically, what we refer to in theology as Theodicy. Some would call it the problem of evil. What causes or who causes evil? Job addresses the central theological question: why do the righteous suffer? And I guess This question is somehow one of those critical questions that Christians and believers would ask. Why is it that it appears as if those who worship the most are those who suffers the most? If you're talking about demographics right now, you realize that there is rampant suffering in African communities. But at the same time, these are the communities globally with the highest number of Christians or believers. So it leaves us the question, why do the righteous suffer? In one of my native dialects or language, Shona, when they have a saying which goes like, Munakanaka ha'ararami, transliterated or translated in English as, a good person doesn't live long. A good person doesn't live long. So again, we have to question, why is it that the righteous suffer? So in the book of Job, retribution theology is challenged. Job's friends assume a strict formula. Righteousness equals to blessings. Righteousness equals to blessing. Sin equals to suffering. That was the kind of understanding that was prevalent in Job's community, or predominant in Job's community. Righteousness equals to blessing, and sin equals to suffering. So it was the norm. Anyone who is seen prospering in life, that was because they were being blessed by God for the good deeds they were doing. Anyone seen suffering in life or poverty, or even to some cases disability, was associated with sin. Somebody should have sinned for this man or this woman to be suffering or to be disabled. But this kind of theology is being challenged in the book of Job. This reflects traditional wisdom thought like themes found in Proverbs. However, Job's experience contradicts this simplistic theology or system or belief system. The book dismantles mechanically retribution theology. Again, related to the question, why do the righteous suffer, is the same thing that we see in the book of Job. The new idea or concept of innocent suffering. It was unknown before Job in his community that the innocent people or the righteous will suffer. It was known that the evil people will suffer. Job is declared blameless and upright. That is in Job chapter 1 verse 1. Yet he suffers immensely. If there's somebody in the history of humanity who has suffered more than Job, that would be maybe too much. Job can contest and win when you talk about people who experienced pain in their life histories. This prepares the theological groundwork for later biblical revelation, ultimately fulfilled in the suffering of the righteous servant in Isaiah chapter 53. So, a question is being answered here. or a prophetic message is being unveiled in the book of Job, justifying the suffering of Christ himself. So the moment we ask, why does the righteous suffer? Then somebody can ask you the same question. If you stick to the formula that sinful people are the ones who suffer, then are you saying Christ was sinful? So just like Christ, Job was sinless according to the declaration of the Bible, but he suffered immensely. Let's talk about the doctrine of Satan. Job provides one of the earliest biblical portrayals of Satan. Satan appears as an accuser within a heavenly council, but more importantly, under divine authority. So Satan was never autonomous. He was always under divine authority according to Job. This contributes to a developing biblical theology of evil that culminates in the New Testament portrayal of opposition of Christ, e.g., for example, in Matthew chapter 4. The key theological insight in this case is evil is real, but not ultimate. And this is important, and I would repeat it again. The most important takeaways from Job's theology is evil is real, but never the ultimate. Evil is real, but never the ultimate. Suffering is real, but should never be the ultimate. So we may be facing a lot of challenges, but if we read the book of Job, we get this kind of confidence and hope that whatever we are going through today is real, but it should never be ultimate or final. There is still life after suffering. The doctrine of wisdom. The book of Job is wisdom literature. Job chapter 28, the poem on wisdom declares, "The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom." This is in Job. This aligns with the foundational principles also expressed in Proverbs chapter 9 verse 10 following. Wisdom in Job is not intellectual. It is reverent submission. So wisdom according to Job is never intellectual mastery. It is reverent submission. The doctrine of righteousness. Job's righteousness is not relational. In fact, Job's righteousness is relational. It is relational. His righteousness is relational, not ritualistic. In other words, he was righteous not because he feared God or because he was living in fear. He was righteous because he had a relationship with God. He had a strong relationship with God. He understood God. Therefore, he was righteous. And this is unlike some of us Christians today. Some of us, we are righteous because we treat God maybe as a super policeman. Somebody who sees what happens in the darkness or under the water. So when you think about when we're about to commit a sin, sometimes we are guided not by the fact that we have a relationship that we want to emulate the God the God whom we worship, but we are restricted because we fear. So the moment you proceed to, the moment you think about, okay, God is going to punish me, but not now, but maybe in 1,000 years to come, then you'd say, okay, therefore maybe I can just do whatever I want to do like now, since the punishment is not imminent. But Job's righteousness was relational. This reflects patriarchal faith like that of Abraham, whose righteousness was grounded in faith and relationship rather than the Mosaic law. The doctrine of revelation. Job teaches us or shows us two types of revelation. Number one, general revelation. By general revelation, we mean, if we read the book of Job, we see God in nature, what we call nature imagery. We see God appearing in wind, nature imagery. Number two, creation theology. Then thirdly, the cosmic order. So we see all these kinds of revelation engraved within the book of Job. The nature imagery, the creation theology, as well as the cosmic order. But the book of Job also talks about special revelation. Things like God speaking from a whirlwind. God is speaking from a wind. That's special revelation now. The direct divine address, God addressing issues directly, that's special revelation. The climax of the book of Job is not explanation, but revelation. So the climax in understanding the book of Job is not about explaining the date of authorship, it's not about explaining who wrote it, it's not about explaining the cultural background behind the climax, because this is a theological, highly theological document. So the climax in the book of Job is not about explanation, it is about revelation. God does not give Job reasons. He gives Job himself. The doctrine of human limitation. Throughout the dialogues, Job seeks answers. The friends defend traditional theology. Elihu attempts to mediate, but all human voices fall short. When God speaks, human argument ceases. Now the theological message is, finite minds cannot fully comprehend infinite purposes. But the ninth doctrinal matter dealt with in the book of Job is the idea or the doctrine of redemptive foreshadowing. By redemptive foreshadowing, we are saying the book of Job exposes redemption in the future. It mirrors the future redemption or salvation of humanity or human beings or creatures. Though not explicit, Job anticipates later redemption themes. In Job chapter 19 verse 25, Job declares, I know that my Redeemer lives. I know that my Redeemer lives. This is a very profound, powerful statement of hope. I know that my Redeemer lives. This anchors and supports the statement that the teaching of Job that we talked about earlier in this lecture or this Bible study session. That suffering, evil, is real, but never permanent or ultimate. This is the exactly point that is nailed here in Job chapter 19 verse 25 verse 25. I know that my Redeemer lives. in the midst of suffering, in the midst of being tortured by friends' accusations, in the midst of being left alone by almost everyone, Job still holds on. I know that my Redeemer lives. So despite what we are going through as believers, this statement can carry you to the next day or the next level. I know that my Redeemer lives. Whatever circumstance, whatever situation that you are in right now, just tell yourself, I know that my Redeemer lives. Suffering is never permanent. It is not the ultimate. It is just temporary. I know that my Redeemer lives. This anticipates a fuller redemptive theology later revealed in Romans and fulfilled in Christ. The book of Job moves from suffering to restoration, pointing towards ultimate restoration in God's redemptive plan. The book of Job provides theological grounding in the sovereignty of God, the mystery of suffering, the insufficiency of simplistic theology, the necessity of reverent wisdom, the supremacy of divine revelation. This book teaches us that faith does not rest on full understanding, but on trust in the character of God. So what can we conclude from this? The theology of the theology of Job reminds us that we may not understand God's ways. We may not know the heavenly conversations. We may not grasp the reason for suffering, but we can know the God who governs all things, and that is important. We may not understand all other things about this God, but we should at least have hope that suffering is never permanent. It is real but not permanent. It is real but not the ultimate. Because Job teaches us, I know that my Redeemer lives. The book of Job does not solve suffering philosophically, but it anchors the suffering theology. It does not explain to us philosophically or in philosophical terms what suffering is all about or what causes suffering, but it teaches us a very, very profound theology here, that suffering, evil, is never the ultimate, is never permanent. It is real but never permanent. It is just temporary because our Redeemer lives. Job challenges retributive theology. In pastoral care, must avoid simplistic explanations and instead accompany the sufferer faithfully. So when you read the book of Job or study it, after studying the book of Job, friends, you will be very, very equipped to walk with somebody through all the suffering stages. No matter what kind of suffering, you will be able to walk with that particular individual throughout their suffering phase, making sure that they still maintain their faith in God. So you have even relevant things, you will know even relevant things to relevant things or ways to say when you encounter somebody who is in the midst of suffering. So the book of Job is very, very relevant in this world whereby people are suffering terribly. So the book of Job deals with issues like what is the basis in what basis does God deal with people? Elsewhere in the Old Testament, God typically repay good with good and evil with evil. But that is not the case in the book of Job. The book of Job deals essentially with the issue of human's relationship with God. And it gives us an answer. Why do we worship God? How will human beings react to God when God seems unconcerned about our problems? So sometimes we suffer to the extent that we think that God is not concerned. But God is always concerned. And that was exactly the point of Job's friends. Their issue was, why do you still maintain or stick to this God who is not concerned? But Job knew it, that suffering, evil, is real, but never permanent. I know that my Redeemer lives. Now, friends, after unpacking all this background of the book of Job, in our next lecture, we start now touching the major themes in the book of Job, starting with the perfect person or the perfect person. In Job chapter 1, verses 1 to 22. Then after that, we discuss or talk about the miserable comforters. Then the hurting God, the clay daysmen, and the question, where are you, God? Double restoration. And we'll conclude our Bible study session with lessons from the book of Job. So we have started the pilgrimage already, the adventurous journey in the book of Job. And I would encourage you to continue following and joining us in our future sessions, because this is now becoming more and more interesting. May God richly bless.